no one was talking about that experience, right? And we would go to school and no one would talk about identity or race or culture. There was a disconnect between us and the teachers who were serving our community. The same thing would happen with like local police officers.
Hello and welcome to the Sweet Spot.
Welcome! We're so excited today.
We're very excited today.
Oh my
we
goodness.
have an amazing young man here.
Did you say amazing yet?
Kind of amazing. I really don't have enough words to describe this young man, actually, because he's pretty special.
In other words, there's no words to describe him. We can't even come up with the words. And so I referred to him as a compassionate, pragmatic academic.
I like that. But
Yeah,
there's so many more words to add to that list.
That does fall
You know,
short,
it just,
doesn't it?
yeah, it really does. But anyway, why don't we just tell them who we have in the Sweet Spot today?
We sure will. And so it is now not just author, not just a lawyer, but a friend. Yeah. Jamil Jivani is our very special guest. Jamil, welcome.
Well, thanks for
Welcome to
having
the
me.
Sweet Spot, Jamil. We're
Thank you.
so excited to have you. And Jamil is a friend. He's a personal friend of ours. And man, I'm getting to know him, and he's something special.
No question about it.
Special, right?
And what a wonderful story, right?
Yeah.
It is a story of overcoming, right? That old song, "We Shall Overcome."
Yeah.
And he has overcome and overcome so many things. And you know, the reality is life is not a destination, it's a journey, right? And
Absolutely.
so he's still overcoming.
Absolutely.
Yes, he's still
And
beating
we
the
just
odds.
want to let our listeners and our viewers know that Jamil just wrote a book.
Yes, he
Right?
sure did. So
And we don't have the book here in the studio, but we can tell them the name of the book and where to find it.
yes, we can.
Okay, can you do that for us?
The book is called Why Young Men, and you can find it online. Let's hear Jamil's voice, so we make sure that we get all of the.
Yes,
So Jamil, welcome, and please tell us where we can get the book.
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon at Indigo and Chapters. It's widely available. Yeah, it's been we've had some good success with the book so far. So
Yes,
Huge success with the book so far.
yeah.
Amazing book. You guys, listen, trust me, you have to go and get this book. It is outstanding.
It is a bestseller in
Yeah,
Canada,
outstanding.
and already a lot of heat coming because he's actually going to be opening up in the States, in the U.S.
Amazing.
In January. So the book will.
So you
will
have to go and get the book.
That's right,
Why Young Men, Jamil Jivani.
Yes,
Jamil,
so-
welcome to the Sweet Spot.
thank you.
So where do we want to start? So
well-
much to talk about.
Well, I think we should start at the beginning.
Okay,
right?
let's do it.
We should
Let's
start.
do it.
Start with his story, right from the beginning. And so Jamil grew up in Toronto here. So rather than us sort of give the details, why don't you just talk a little bit about your upbringing?
Yeah, so I was born in Toronto. My mom is a white Canadian of Scottish and Irish background. My father immigrated to Canada from Kenya, and I grew up mostly
Kenya and Scottish.
And Scottish,
Yeah,
yeah.
So that's
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Is that a rare combination?
not as rare as you might think, but
okay.
we're rare enough. Yeah,
That's right.
Wow,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
okay.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I grew up mostly in Brampton, in a Jamaican and Sikh neighborhood. So most of my classmates in school, most of my neighbors were first generation Canadians whose parents had moved to Canada from other places. And so it was an interesting time to be in Brampton too, because I always say, we were older than the houses we lived in. So all the houses were brand new. So it was a unique time where you could be a single mother and afford a house in Brampton, which, as we know now, property values across the Toronto
For sure.
area are so high
For sure.
that that's not true anymore.
Exactly.
But it was when I was a kid. And so it made for a very diverse community in terms of economics and culture and race. It was an interesting time to grow up there.
Wow. Very interesting.
So then, as a kid growing up in Brampton, what do you remember as a younger kid, right? How do you remember that experience?
Yeah, I remember feeling like there's a term I use in the book to describe it. We were kind of in-betweeners. We were kind of between where our parents came from and where we were living. Like, we didn't feel particularly Canadian, but we also were nothing else. So we were Canadian by default, right? And because the neighborhood we lived in was so new, it almost felt like we were kind of like pioneers trying to figure out what our identity meant. And so even as young people, I think we had this sense of, who do we turn to for cultural leadership? Like, who's going to show us who we are and what it means to be Black or brown-skinned person in Canada. And that was at the time when you're a kid, you don't realize that's what's happening. But I do remember, we would turn on the TV and like see, that's where we would get these kind of like older examples of what it looks like to be a Black man or a brown man. And we would find our role models in pop culture more than we would in our own neighborhood, because we were lacking some of that local culture and those local institutions. We didn't have many traditions that our parents handed down to us because we were living a reality very different from our parents. They had come from another place, right?
I can understand that. Our girls kind of talked about that as well. Us being American and then being, born in Canada. So we can understand that.
Yeah.
Yes. Thinking back now, how would you define your Canada at that time?
It was almost like I would say it felt kind of leaderless, right? Meaning we didn't have, so no one was talking about that experience, right? And we would go to school and no one would talk about identity or race or culture. There was a disconnect between us and the teachers who were serving our community. The same thing would happen with like local police officers. There was tension sometimes between the young people and the cops in our neighborhood. And it almost was like no one really knew what to do about it. I think there was a lot of good intentions on both sides, but there were just communication gaps. We didn't understand each other. We didn't know how to communicate well. So it felt very leaderless. Like, who's supposed to take charge here? Who's supposed to say, okay, we have a disconnected part of our city. How do we tie these people together? How do we build some sort of common vision and identity that people can share, and some common language that we can talk about what's going on in our community? Right. I think for some of us, that was happening in the local Gurdwara, which is kind of a Sikh temple. We had one near our neighborhood, and so I think a lot of the families who were involved in that community were getting some of that leadership. But for those of us who weren't, which was a big chunk of us, we had nowhere to go. There was no kind of local leadership. So I would say like our Canada was just very undefined, and it wasn't really clear whose job it is to figure that out. And in the process, I think that there was a lot of variability in how we figured it out, right? So some of us became really into like hip hop as a way to develop an identity in our area. Some of us, as I mentioned, became very close to the Gurdwara. A lot of my Sikh friends were very religious and pious people, and then others of us, wound up, dropping out of school and trying to work when they were 14, 15 years old. Some of them wound up in prison by the time we were teenagers. There was just a lot of variation in how we figured that out, because it felt like it was on us. Like, we were these young people who felt like we had that on our shoulders to figure it out, and no one was doing it for us.
So looking back, who do you think should have been those leaders in your community?
Well, I mean, the first line of defense, for young people is always, your parents, right? And I think we had a large percentage of us growing up without fathers in my neighborhood. So I think that put our families in kind of a weakened position to be able to help us. A lot of our mothers were just, making sure we had enough food and had a place to live. They couldn't think about these other things. They didn't have the time and energy to, right? So my starting point was always, I think if we had stronger families and families that were better adjusted to Canadian life, I think we could have been better supported. But beyond that, there's also, we were sent to school for 7-8 hours a day, right? And so I think our schools should have felt more responsibility to understand what we were going through. And there's a real problem there where our schools were almost like, 2 decades behind in adjusting to what the demographics were and what the population was dealing with. So that was another, if I could go back in time, I think, I don't want to say better teachers, I want to say maybe better prepared teachers for what was actually happening in our lives would have made a difference. Like, one thing I always say, and I've shared this about the high school I went to, which actually is in Mississauga and closed down permanently last month. and I had a chance to kind of write a bit of a summary of what life was like going to that high school. And one of the things I would say is that, for myself and a lot of my friends in high school, family was a big part of our lives, like for mostly for bad reasons, but also for good reasons.
Right.
And family is an issue that the school system just doesn't touch on at all. Like, unless you're in the most extreme situation, in which case they're probably calling a social worker,
Right.
you probably don't talk about family in any way. And it's like stuff like that where it's like, well, if you got a bunch of kids that are thinking about, their missing fathers or the struggles they see their mom go through or all these things, and then you go to school for 8 hours a day and no one talks to you about those things and no one wants to help you work through those problems or even develop the language to talk about what's going on in your life, it's hard not to feel like the school's not there for you, that they were designed for somebody else, right? The school day. And so I think schools could have made a world of difference in my life and others, and eventually did in my case, but it took a longer time than I wish it had.
How about the good? Are there good memories about growing up?
Yeah, I mean, we had a very safe community. Like, I always describe us as kind of, a lot of us are poor in imagination, meaning we didn't understand what we could do in our lives. We had a very narrow vision of our future, but the truth is that we were very safe, like not much violent crime at all. The schools were well funded, right? We had a new community center with a library and a swimming pool nearby us. As I mentioned, the Gurdwara nearby was a fantastic source of support for a lot of families. So there was a lot of positive in the sense that there were opportunities there. I just think we weren't ready to take advantage of a lot of the opportunities. So it was a bit of a mismatch, but we absolutely were blessed. Like, when I look back on my approach to education for most of my childhood, I kind of shudder to think of what I kind of took for granted. There are a lot of people in the world, even people in this part of the world, right, in Canada, who don't have a quarter of the opportunity I had. And yet I was not really in a position to see my life in that way, to see the privilege around me, right? I was so focused on what I didn't have that I wasn't realizing all the things I did have.
Right. You talk about your dad and him not being around much. Can you talk just really quickly about the one memory that stands out with you with your dad?
Yeah. Probably the one that stands out the most is when I was in grade 3, so I was 7 or 8 years old. For some reason, there was like a bunch of days where he was coming home really late, and he would wake me up at night to say hi. And those stick out because I didn't see him as much as I wish I did. So when he would wake me up, I'd be so happy. And one night he woke me up and he was crying, and it was the only time I had ever really seen emotion come from him. And he sat on my bed and I was like, are you okay? And he said, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And I remember being just kind of scared of so does that mean work? Does that mean be my dad? What does he mean when he says he can't do this? And he just kind of talked to me about how he works really hard and he just kind of felt overwhelmed by his life. And then he sat there in silence and kind of, wiped the tears from his face and walked out. And that was maybe the only real conversation we ever had where I felt like he was being completely honest with me. And it sticks out to me because when I was writing my book, I was forcing myself to see him as another fatherless young man, right? So instead of just being angry at him for what he wasn't, to understand him for who he was. And that kind of stood out to me as a reminder of, the fact that he was having that kind of conversation with his 8-year-old son was a sign of the lack of support he had in his own life, right? He didn't have friends or his own dad he could go to talk about those things. So yeah, that stands out a lot to me. And I look back on that as that was the year where I kind of realized he wasn't going to be around for much longer. And so that stands out for that reason too, as kind of one of the last moments where I kind of had that fantasy a lot of kids have, that life is normal, and then you realize actually it's not anymore,
Right.
Yeah.
That's a heavy statement to make to a 7-8-year-old.
Yeah.
Right. How were you able to digest that?
I don't think I did a very good job. I kind of just pushed that to the back of my mind until I got older. And then, when I was a teenager and I would, things like Father's Day would come and you like think about how you don't have a father around. Like I would think back to those days and, be resentful more than anything. I think, when my book came out and I started to talk about my father more, one of my younger sister, Jasmine, kind of said to me, "This is the first time we've seen you talk about him and not be angry," because I was so used to just being angry anytime his name came up. Like I would get, you could see it in me. Like I would turn red and I'd tear up and I would just have nothing but resentment toward him. So I think the book was kind of therapeutic in the sense that I could go back to those memories of when I was 8 and think about them differently. Instead of saying, how dare he talk to his son like that, right? I could look back and say, actually, it's kind of sad that he talked to his son that way. That there's like something tragic to that, not just something to be angry about. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Love that.
Did faith play a direct role in your upbringing?
So my mom is a Protestant, and my father is Muslim, and she kind of, I guess, like promised him she would not kind of force a religion on us out of respect for the fact that they had two different faiths. So, I mean, God bless her, like even in his absence for years, she stayed true to that promise and took it very seriously. So I think faith played a role in my life more so in absence, right? So the fact that we had a Sikh temple in my community, but not a church or a mosque, meant that I didn't really get exposed to any kind of faith the way some of my Sikh friends did. And if I look back on who benefited most from the opportunities in our neighborhood, it's the people who were most ingrained in their kind of temple. So I think that in the absence of that in my neighborhood where I grew up, that was a big deal. But it also meant that as I got older, I spent a lot of time with kind of conspiracy theories and, following like Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam and spin-off groups of theirs on the internet. And all of those were kind of distortions of faith in some way, because I didn't know enough about faith to know what was kind of a genuine attempt to understand God and the world, and what was a political movement that was masquerading as a faith movement, right? And I think that's how a lot of the young men I write about in the book also experience faith, that they might, their parents might have an understanding of Christianity or Islam or Judaism, but when they kind of go out into the world, they don't have that foundation. And so people are able to manipulate certain concepts and certain words, and they sound like they're speaking from a faith perspective, but they're really just providing political ideology. And I spent a lot of years kind of wrapped up in that kind of stuff until I got old enough to understand the difference between the two.
You thoughtfully mentioned your sisters.
Yeah.
And maybe talk about the dynamic of being a big brother in that environment as well.
Yeah, I think, so I have two younger sisters, Jasmine and Janine, and I think that not having a father around when you're an older brother puts a certain kind of responsibility on you, right? And it's one that I didn't take very seriously for most of our growing up. And it wasn't until I was old enough to kind of be a man, 18, 19 years old, that it started to be serious for me. But yeah, I think, there's some differences too, I think, in between how I experienced our neighborhood versus how they did. For instance, like my interactions with police officers were a big part of how I developed a certain kind of anger about the unfairness that I saw in the world. And they didn't really have the same interactions with police officers. They weren't stopped. They weren't kind of treated like criminals the same way I was. So there were some differences between us. And I think those differences made it hard for us to understand each other when we were kids. But then as I got old enough and, especially I think as I took school more seriously, school wound up being a way for us to kind of have some common experiences. And I think that improved our relationship quite a bit.
Now, you talked about, before you had your aha moment, an experience that you went through with a gun.
Yeah.
Can you share that with us?
Yeah, so I entered high school playing what I describe as like a game of chicken with myself. So I was constantly trying to outdo myself, right? So in grade 9, I was trying to be this gangster tough guy, and so I would get into fights in the cafeteria. And then by grade 10, I'm getting suspended from school.
Now, what kind of fighter were you?
No. I could take a lot of punches. But, I was like a big enough guy that mostly it was bigger guys that would fight me. So they were not easy fights. But like, I had a, Louisville Slugger baseball bat in my school locker that, when there were fights, I would bring out. Like, it was fighting and conflict were such a big part of, my life. And so by the time I'm in grade 11, you're kind of looking at, well, what comes next, right? And the escalation kind of led to the point where I thought it made sense to get a gun. I was trying to impress my friends who were drug dealers, and so I wanted to, kind of be part of that lifestyle. So I asked a friend of mine whose older brother could get a gun to, find one for me. He quoted me a price. And I looked back a lot on that day when I was writing my book because if you look at my life up to that point, the opportunity to buy a gun should have been this kind of like amazing moment where it's like, finally I get to be this gangster that I had dreamed about. And then instead I like went home and I just like cried that day, And that kind of like reminds me of like that day my father was like crying in my room when I was a kid because it was it's like tears you don't know what to do with. When I look back, I think and I didn't wind up buying the gun. In fact, I kind of lost a lot of my friends because I just felt so embarrassed that I had built up this like tough guy image that I couldn't live up to, right? And so when I look back on kind of why that happened, I think there were kind of two reasons. So one is that, through all these years that I was getting in trouble and not trying in school and just kind of squandering opportunity, my mother was the only person who ever said anything nice to me or kind of believed I could be a good person. And her kind of faith in me just never wavered. And I had this feeling of like, if I buy this gun, I'm going to cross a line that she might even kind of lose faith in me, right? That like I might just go too far even for her. And the prospect of losing her was like I was scared of, right? And I knew that if I crossed the line, it wasn't just like I'd have a gun, but it's like now I'm a person who carries around a gun and who has problems with other people who carry around guns. And so it was just this cycle that I knew I'd be getting into, and I knew my mom would not be happy about that. And then the other reason was that, I was so, as I mentioned, like I was very angry at police officers at that point in my life. And I had this sense of, I'm being treated like I have weapons and that I'm a criminal, and I'd be validating that in some way if I bought a gun, right? I mean, it'd be somewhat like saying you were right that to treat me like I carry around a gun because I do now. So I didn't want to kind of do either of those things. And that day, my life didn't change kind of overnight on that day, but I always kind of point to that day as the beginning of what was a process of transformation, because it was the first time in my life that I think I ever thought about how my choices affect other people, right? Like I was thinking about my mom, I was thinking about like the stigma and stereotyping that affects my community. And up to that point, I was so fixated on all the unfairness directed toward me and being a victim and being resentful to other people that I had never thought, well, I actually have some power to make decisions and that those decisions can positively and negatively affect others. So what is my responsibility here? And that was a kind of a spark of different thinking that I think eventually evolved into me, being a different person and I think a better person. Yeah.
Wow.
Now, the extraordinary is first of all, but did this precede the famous bus ride?
It was after. It was after,
right?
yeah.
So
the famous bus ride is, I start the book with that story of being in grade 11 and having to rewrite the grade 10 literacy test, which all students in Ontario have to do. And I call that the famous bus ride because that was kind of, I guess, a day where the way I was labeled by the school system was kind of emotionally devastating. And I was like, tearing up on the bus and burying my head in a backpack because I had kind of outed myself as an illiterate person by showing up to school that day, right? Or that morning. And that day, I think that's a great way to kind of start my story because not only does it show kind of how far, kind of I've come in the sense that I in a year and a half went from being illiterate to having the highest grades at Humber College.
Wow.
And I think a lot of people who are called illiterate probably have that potential, right?
Absolutely.
But also, it was a day that just kind of summed up that frustration I had with my life and with other people, right? Like I was going to school that day feeling like I am so angry that I have to go through this, even though a lot of the reason why I failed the test is mostly because I just wasn't trying, right? But I didn't see it that way. I saw it as everybody else's fault.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
So what was the transition like? Because you just kind of briefed us that you went from riding that bus, right, the ride of shame, right, to having the highest scores at Humber, right. So how did that whole transition from high school to college happen, and then some other things happen from there?
So a few things. So one is that, as I had mentioned about the kind of feeling like you have some responsibility to other people in the decisions you make, that kind of gradually evolved to feeling some responsibility for my family, right? My younger sisters.
Yes.
And I think realizing the impact my poor example was having on them kind of forced me to want to step up a little bit. Also, it was that I lost all my friends by kind of realizing I wasn't going to be a gangster, right? And so when I lost all my friends, I kind of had very little place to put my energy aside from school. So it was almost by eliminating all the other options, I was left with school for the first time. And so I just kind of went all in. And once I went all in, I learned fast and I performed well, and I had good relationships with some professors, and that made a big difference. And what they did well for me too, in terms of helping me bridge, right? Because it's not easy to go from I'm not trying at all to I'm getting good grades. So you need help, right? It's not just me. I needed a lot of help. And what my professors did that was very effective was they kind of bridged the worlds I was in. So they would say, we know you're reading a lot of, kind of stuff by the Nation of Islam on the internet. Why don't you do your school assignment about that, right? And so it was a way to start bringing myself into the classroom, and they would then give me some of the critical thinking skills to examine that stuff and say, is that actually right? Is that actually the way I want to live my life? Is that moral? Is that true? So they made education practical for me in a way that it wasn't when I was in high school or in middle school. And so by doing that and then me experiencing my personal changes, it kind of made for a perfect storm to put me in a different place. So when I had gotten I got the President's Medal at Humber College and then went on to York University and got a scholarship to Yale Law School.
You are amazing.
Extraordinary.
You are my hero, seriously. Your story is extraordinary.
And it just gets better.
Exactly. We can't wait for you to come back so the listeners and viewers can continue to hear your phenomenal story. So thank you once again. And until next time, stay in your sweet spot.